when Jackie Kennedy visited Pakistan? 62. Do you recall that? Well, let me tell you about it. And keep that in mind next time you think of American foreign policy, because that was foreign policy. President Ayub Khan visited the United States of America as the President of Pakistan. John Kennedy had just become president. He was given a ticker tape parade in New York, addressed the joint session in Washington, was given a state dinner at Mount Vernon, Washington's estate, and Kennedy praised Pakistan as a great ally, great friend, great culture, great history, and sent Jackie Kennedy on a solo visit. I think it was the first solo visit to Pakistan. And in my book, Journey into America, there's a picture of Jackie Kennedy standing alongside President Ayub Khan in an open car in Lahore, surrounded by hundreds of Pakistanis smiling and grinning and throwing flower petals at her. And then she went on to the tribal areas of Pakistan, where today it's impossible for anyone to be visiting those areas. And Jackie Kennedy was then warmly welcomed by the tribal chiefs. So we have to ask ourselves, there was a foreign policy when the world saw America as an ally, as a friend, as a very positive factor on the world stage. That's how Pakistan was looking at the United States. And today, as Mr. Bajwa has said, there's anger and there's anguish, and you have so much resentment on the ground that I dread to think when this young generation, and that's where we go back to the whole tribal notion, this young generation of Somalis and Pakistanis and Afghanis come of age. And they're going to be just mad at someone. Who are they going to blame for the condition of their lives? Their own governments, their own rulers, what they think are the powers that are supporting their rulers. They see Mr. Bajwa has mentioned the drone strikes. In Pakistan alone, something like 60,000 Pakistanis. We lost 3,000 on 9/11, and this has consumed the nation. Pakistan has lost 60,000 completely innocent people. They had nothing to do with 9/11. None of the hijackers were from Pakistan or Afghanistan. 60,000 Pakistanis have died as a direct consequence of 9/11. So there's a lot of anger, and there's a lot of resentment, and there are a lot of answers requiring questions that we want to ask. What is this question? What is this answer? And we need to really engage in this dialogue, otherwise we won't come to any answers.
We have time for perhaps two more questions. We'll get one here, and then Jen, if you would select one final question.
This is on. Sir, assalamu alaikum. I've been waiting about 4 years to ask you this question. I spent the last 6 years in the Middle East teaching English to Arabic students, 5 years in Oman, and the last year in Yemen. I left Yemen on March 11th, just after the demonstrations began. I bought your book here at the Borders bookstore, Islam Today, which is published in 1999, and it was awarded the Los Angeles Times Best Nonfiction Book of the Year, reissued in 2002. This book is very comprehensive, but I'm curious to know why this book does not mention the Iran-Iraq War. I don't know if your other books have mentioned the Iran-Iraq War, the 9-year war, 8-year war in the 80s, which was a very disturbing war, but it's not mentioned in this book. Can you explain why?
I don't exactly recall the circumstances, because this book is actually based on something I wrote in the late 1980s called Discovering Islam. And while the Iran-Iraq War, of course, is an extremely important development in the region, to my mind, I was looking at history in vast sweeps. So the Iran-Iraq War is very much a regional war between neighbors. And neighbors are constantly in conflict in the Muslim world. Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, the border tensions exist. Iran-Iraq tensions are not recent. Of course, in this war, they erupted into massive killings on both sides, Pakistan, Afghanistan tensions. And it may have been this reason that I was taking the sweep of history and therefore overlooked to mention it in detail. I promise in the next edition I will pay attention to that. And thank you for flashing it around.
We have one question left. Jim?
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for coming to KU. My name is Mohammed, and I had a question for you. You mentioned Salman Rushdie in his book about Islam and the reaction in the Muslim world. I read somewhere that his wife, a few years before he wrote the book, wrote a book similar to his book. Was she was aiming at Jesus Christ, and her book was insulting about Jesus Christ, but there was no such reaction in the Western world. But you mentioned that there are sensitive issues in the Western world that maybe raise people's reaction, and you mentioned Constitution. But I was wondering, is a Holocaust a sensitive issue in the Western world? Because in Europe, David Irving had this Holocaust denial, and he was arrested for this. And I would like to hear your comment on that.
Yes, there's no doubt the Holocaust is a very sensitive event. And as a Muslim, I have been to the Holocaust Museum. And you're a Muslim by your name. I would advise you, have you been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington? I would advise you to visit it simply to understand the scale of what happened. It will leave you shaken because you're confronted by the depth of evil that man is capable of doing to man. Now, of course, Muslims see this very much as a Jewish tragedy. It is a Jewish tragedy, but it's also a world tragedy. It's a human tragedy. And because there were attempts to deny that it ever happened, and there were attempts to brush it away from history, it became very sensitive. And you can understand the sensitivities. You're talking of a population. The Jewish population of Europe was a very tiny population. And out of that, I'm not sure of the exact figures, but something like half perished in the Holocaust. I'm not sure, is that correct, Bill?
I don't
Would
recall.
someone be able? That's correct. So about half perished. Now, Mohammed, which country are you from originally?
Iran.
Now, you think of Iran because I know your president's being accused of denying the Holocaust. What is the population of Iran?
7.
Suppose 35 million, God forbid, were actually killed and burnt and tortured and humiliated and just extinguished as human lives. You can imagine the impact on the Iranian people. This is what happened to the Jewish community. And we should all be conscious of this and make sure it never ever happens again. That's the lesson to take from it. Now, to make that into a controversial subject, whether it existed, didn't exist, or whether we are sensitive to it or not, I think is really demeaning the memory of what happened then and the people who died there. So I think Muslims have to be much more sensitive to the Holocaust and the way, because it's become a symbol of something.